Hello and welcome to the special interview with the unique global Indian. We are with Sri Manchala, CEO of Trianz, a leading digital transformation services firm. Sri is on the Forbes Technology Council and is the author of Crossing the Digital Faultline 10 Rules of Highly Successful Leaders in Digitalization. Interestingly, before he started out on his corporate journey, Sri was a member of the elite special forces of the Indian Army. Today, we are here to discuss key insights on digital transformation from his recent book. Thank you so much for being here with us, Sri.
Nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
First, I want to start out by asking you what really inspired you to writing Crossing the Digital Faultline? And was the book already in the works when the pandemic hit? Or was it that the pandemic hit us and because of the digital transformation, the disruption that came about? Because today, digital transformation strategy and a roadmap to get there is very, very critical for any organization.
Right. So, as you know, we are a digital technologies and transformation services firm. So we deal with a lot of issues around business model change and analytics, and helping management become data-driven, changing experiences that they deliver to various stakeholders, etc. But when we started on this journey, I would say about 4 or 5 years ago, the whole thing was very nebulous and very poorly understood. And so we started a research project to think about transformation from our end client's point of view. Consultants oftentimes tend to think from their point of view. And so we launched a massive global survey covering 18 industries worldwide. And we spoke to leaders across the enterprise to see what transformation meant to them, how they defined it, where they were today, where they want to go, how they are prioritizing, what kind of technologies they're investing in, how ready is the organization, their leadership, etc. And the idea behind that was for us to understand these transformations better, so we are more effective in advising our clients. We have to be ahead of our clients in what we do. When all of that data came in, which was over 10,000 responses, we analyzed that, and we found some very interesting insights. We found that very few companies succeed, roughly around 7 to 8%, and this is pre-COVID. And we then went into the causal factors of their success. And we were able to document those. And we were able to see how companies evolve on the digital curve and what different stages of maturity mean. But what was very sort of provocative for me was, what is the reason why these 7% succeed? Oftentimes we think about why people fail, but it's far more interesting to see why people succeed. Among so many factors, the single biggest thing that stood out for me was the ability of the leaders to understand what these transformations are and then confront the reality of change and actually do it. And so when those insights revealed themselves, I'm a CEO and I can put myself in the shoes of other CEOs and clients who I speak with. So I just felt that this would be a nice professional contribution to give back, to our clients and the industry at large.
So I want to ask you, why the name, Crossing the Digital Faultline? Because typically fault lines are associated with problems, and digital is really about transformation. It's about enabling business transformation, etc. So why did you come up with this very unique name, and what's the story behind that?
Great question. There's an interesting anecdote behind it, which sort of became a metaphor that I used in the book. I was in Tokyo in 2011, and that's when this massive earthquake hit a place off of Tokyo called Sendai, and then it had about 200 to 300 minor aftershocks, etc. The world knows today, massive nuclear disaster, meltdown, hundreds of thousands of people dead, billions of dollars lost, etc. But in the moment when we were in the earthquake in Tokyo, everything was very different. The ground wasn't stable, skyscrapers were moving around, everything had come to a standstill. And the metaphor really is that when something of this magnitude takes place, the fundamentals that have been carrying you, the rules of business, organization, people, behaviors, consumers, all of that suddenly changes. And as I was writing this book, that experience sort of came back to me because it was an out of the world and larger than life experience. That what we are going through from a business perspective is very similar to that earthquake, where most of us are on this side of the fault line or on the fault line. So from there, we transition to the real business meaning behind this, which is there are stages of transforming. And today, when you look at most of the companies out there, there's a sense of loss of control, lack of predictability, volatility in revenue, the processes of the organization not being able to keep up, etc. This is what happens to companies that are on the wrong side of the fault line, right? And so the idea is to first transform just enough that you regain that control, and hence crossing the digital fault line. Beyond that, things become more predictable and better controlled.
So, Shri, your book is clearly about leadership. It is not just about digital technologies. But yet today, whenever we speak about digital transformation, and whether it's media, whether it's what we hear from businesses, etc., it's technology that first comes to mind. So why this disconnect really between technology and leadership when perhaps digital transformation should be about leadership? And perhaps you can explain that.
Sure, it's a great question. Essentially, the technology side of digital transformation has been hyped up by the tech industry, by consultants, by analysts, etc., almost to a point where leaders think that if I invest in these technologies, we transform. Whereas transformation is a process of moving a company from place A to place B, the way we do business today versus the way we need to do it tomorrow. And as we looked at the data from the research that I described to you earlier, it was very evident to us that the single biggest driving factor of companies that transformed successfully was their leaders. Everything else came, after that. And so I said that one has to elaborate on the sense of leadership in terms of how you understand a problem, how you plan your outcomes, how you plan your end states, and how you sort of move the organization from that place A to place B. And so therefore the leadership dimension becomes very, very critical. And when leaders get it and they move in harmony, the rest of the organization also moves. And technology in this game is an enabler. It's not an end in itself.
So I really wanted to, maybe get you to define digital transformation, because, disruption is a well understood term, and especially today in this COVID pandemic driven environment, I think all of us get disruption, right? But like you said, digital transformation has become a buzzword. Clearly, much of what is touted as digital transformation isn't really digital transformation. So how do you define it?
So let me give you a little bit background first, and then we'll come to the definition. We talked about what digital transformation is not, right? So what I'll say is that over the last 5 to 7 years, there is so much of convergence of technology, right? The way it has impacted society at large, behaviors, norms, buying patterns, usage patterns, etc., and what the end consumers of any industry end up doing with this technology, right? Has had a very, very heavy impact on business. Right? There are numerous examples. We have seen what has happened in retail. We have seen what has happened in entertainment, where the movie houses are less important, and it is Netflix and it is Amazon Prime that are more important, etc., etc. Now, when you think about transformation, right? Your transformation is a consequence of how customers have transformed, right? And so we have to start with the customers. We have to understand in this very strange sort of passage of time we are going through, economic ups and downs, generational change, digital habits, and now the pandemic. You have lost touch with your customers, the physical touch, in many industries, right? Their preferences, right? How they allocate their wallet, how they buy, how they evaluate, how they use, how they upgrade, etc., has gone through a transformation. And so the way we define digital transformation at Trianz in one sentence is digital transformation is the process of reimagining a company's products, services, and value propositions from the customer's point of view, not the company's point of view. And then delivering really good, endearing digital experiences to all stakeholders. So when leaders think about this one-line definition, the piece parts of this begin to emerge from there. So that is our definition.
So Shri, in your book and from your research, a very shocking statistic comes up that only 7% of leaders or companies really succeed in their digital transformation journey, which means shockingly that 93% of leaders and companies don't succeed. So why is that, and what do these companies who get it right, these leaders who get it right, do differently?
Yeah, so maybe that 7% has now accelerated to something like 15, 16% because COVID was a big eye-opener for everybody, and we see our clients and data tells us that the pace of investments has accelerated. When we looked at the responses from these 5,000 plus companies and we started tabulating what makes companies successful and what makes them, some of them extraordinarily successful and some of them, mediocre sort of results and some of them abject sort of failures. There are 5 factors that sort of came up in front of us. One is the transformation of the value proposition of the company, as I said, right, which is rethinking what products and services you're delivering, and then transforming the value chain of the company, right, so that the entire engagement with the customer from the time they buy to the time they upgrade or replace is a very, very experience-driven approach, and embedded in that is the use of technology. And then the last piece is the transformation of the organization. In the book, I say technology does not enable transformations, people do, right? Leaders cannot transform big organizations by themselves. They have to help their people get the change. They have to empower those people and train them and develop them. And once the employees are vested in it, right, then they take over and it becomes a mass movement as opposed to a top-down mandate, right? Now, these are some factors, but above all is a factor called the digital IQ of the collective leadership of the company, right? Now, when the leaders in a CEO's team get the overall concept of change in their industry and how their company has to adapt based on how customers have changed, and they move in harmony with each other, then all the other 4 factors that I talked about start falling in line, right? They collectively think about the value prop. They collectively think about the end-to-end experience from the time a customer does research, that is marketing, to how a product is developed, R&D, how it is sold, sales, how it is serviced, service department, and so on and so forth. Hence that, the digital IQ of the leadership of the company therefore sets the tone for the other 4 or 5 factors.
I also wanted to talk here about your own personal journey, right? I referred to it in the introduction. You were with the elite special forces of the Indian Army. You've been a soldier. You came up from the NDA, etc. Now that itself is very unique because very, very few soldiers get to the elite forces. Everybody wants to get there, but that's get to the special forces. Now, you've gone on from there to leading a Silicon Valley company, a digital transformation company that services clients across the world. You have patents to your name too. So where do you see your own leadership journey in all of this, and how did this inform you as you wrote the book and what you're speaking to us about?
I think there are a couple of dimensions to it. One is that the foundation of a particular leadership style is laid very early for everybody, right? For me, that style and the values and the model largely came from the institutions that I went to. You mentioned them, right? The National Defense Academy, IMA in Dehradun, and the regiments that I served in. And what they teach you is to be able to look at situations and problems very uniquely, right? And not be wedded to a particular point of view, right? And then once you evaluate a particular situation, you address that on its own merits, right? And the choices that you make, therefore, fall out of that, right? And then after that comes the ability to organize teams, the ability to drive change, to motivate people, and to do it in very uncertain terms that we are going through. These are all foundational elements that I learned in the very first part of my career, and I'm extremely grateful for that. But then the other aspect, which is the business experience and the perspectives and the point of view, that comes from experience of having worked with clients and having led transformations and so on. The parallel here is that when you are on the fault line and when the fundamentals are changing, and you understand what that change is about, then leaders have to muster, a great amount of courage to let go of their habits and their comforts and their preconceived notions, and then reinvent themselves. And they have to reinvent themselves first. You cannot order a transformation. If I have 10 people reporting to me in the organization, I have to demonstrate that I understand these transformations better than they do, and only then they're going to sort of follow. So the foundation was laid in the first part of my career, and then it's the experience, but both of them somehow came together. And this is the dilemma of every leader today. First, to understand the problem. When I do, think about the way forward. And number 3 is to stare at the reality of changing oneself and the organization, and then persist until you get the results.
So Shri, in your book, you talk about a new leadership persona called a methodical innovator. And in a way, I found this very fascinating because what this does is this democratizes digital IQ. And that's an area that many, many leaders struggle with. So how can leaders really go about building this?
Great question. So again, when we dove deeper into the data around leadership, right, we tried to develop a stereotype of what these successful leaders are, right? And in management theory and leadership behavior, there are different types of personas, right? There are democratic leaders who build consensus. There are bureaucratic leaders who operate through procedures and policies. There are dictatorial leaders, history is replete with them, who are top-down in everything that they want to do and very merciless about it. Then there are your very transformational sort of leaders, great evangelists, great public speakers, etc. But when we looked at the data, the persona that we were seeing would not match any of these. We have a preconceived notion of what a great leader should be, right? Amazing presence, great speaker, motivator, and should have an MBA and should have done this and should have done that, etc. And this data was telling us a different story. So the methodical innovator essentially is a persona that applies method and not necessarily personality or force to transform the organization. And what that means is that these leaders have a certain process that they follow. They are not your big on-stage personalities. They're very careful thinkers. Oftentimes they're introverts, right? So they study this transformation challenge. They use data to validate what is really happening or where they should go. They prioritize very dispassionately. For example, if I'm a CEO who has come from a sales and marketing background, I will be predisposed and I'll be thinking that as long as we are good on the customer-facing front, right, then we're going to be successful. But what is the use of a sales and marketing transformation when the product the company is churning out is rotary phones that no longer are bought by anyone, right? So when that reality is in front of them because of data, they tend to be very cold and very dispassionate and prioritize correctly, right? They are very patient, aggressive and patient, and they lead from the front, and they invest very, very heavily in their talent. And they keep repeating the process until the results start becoming more and more predictable. Oftentimes, the first 2 rounds of transformations don't deliver those results. So when you think about this particular construct, it gives you a very different set of skills and experiences and persona. That's why we call it a very method-driven or a methodical innovator persona.
Yeah, that's really a fascinating persona, And I also really thought about that because you're so right when you say that, companies, they want rock star CEOs,
Correct.
but really that's really not what is required in the digital age.
Yeah, so you're right. Companies expect rock stars. But you see, the methodical innovator is not a born persona. All others are, right? Great transformational leaders, great visionaries have certain inborn qualities that they grow up with, right? Whereas the methodical innovator persona is an acquired persona, right? It comes with practice. It comes with putting a structure to all of this, which I describe in the book. And it's an acquired taste, right? And so, going back to your point on democratizing digital IQ, what it really means is that every leader has an opportunity to become a methodical innovator, and by following a certain process. So, one doesn't have to be, a rock star to become a methodical innovator.
That's fascinating. Coming down to some sectors, where transformation has really worked. In your book, you've mapped out some industries that have been transformation leaders. Can you elaborate for us, with some examples of some other industries that have been disrupted and which have now opened up the gaps between industry laggards and leaders?
So, if you asked me this question a year and a half ago, I would have sort of described industries in three clusters. The first is industries that have very high customer touch, end consumer touch, such as media and entertainment, or healthcare, or retail, telecom, high tech, banking, etc. Industries that have this very high customer touch are getting feedback loops at very high volumes and very, very quickly. And moves that competitors make in these industries become visible very quickly because everybody at the end of the day is in front of that customer, right? So, for example, if Reliance Jio launches a feature, it's visible to all other competitors, right? Or if Procter & Gamble launches a particular product, it'll be immediately visible to their competitors, and so on and so forth. These industries transform the fastest. And then there are industries right in the middle that are slightly removed from end consumers. They tend to be in the middle of the road. And then there's a third cluster, which is highly regulated industries, like life insurance, health insurance, energy, right, etc. They are oftentimes the slowest moving. But as COVID has progressed and all industries have been forced to rethink, you're now seeing a new breed of what I call as, Davids in the David versus Goliath, metaphor emerging, right? They're defying the velocity and the patterns of the industry. These digital startups, digital tech startups in these different industries are accelerating the pace. So in short, the velocity of change across all industries is going to pick up in the next few years.
Now, with the pandemic, and the pandemic is really front and center, right? We still haven't come out of it, and we don't know whether the light is still the light at the end of the tunnel or still that oncoming train. Which industries do you think will see the maximum benefits of digital transformation and thus will realize outsized benefits, from this disruption?
See, I would rephrase your question to think at a company level and not at an industry level, right? Because if I am a company, no matter what my size is, right, the only choice that I have is to transform, right? In fact, in the book, I describe a particular matrix where if you're a very large company with a massive presence in the industry and you become complacent, your business model will be reinvented. We have seen that in retail. If you're a small company that is weak and slow, you will be extinguished, right? But if you're a small to mid-sized company or a large company, but the velocity of your transformation is fast, then you'll start leading the industry at some point in time. So I would worry less about industry and competition, and I would worry more about where my enterprise or B2C customers are headed and start reinventing my business on that model. And when you do that, every sector has the same opportunity. And the converse is also true. Companies that take their position for granted are no longer going to exist. In fact, in the book, I point out that 30 to 40% of companies that we know today as great brand names will cease to exist by 2030.
That's interestingly something that happened even, I think, about 2 decades ago, right? The companies back, for instance, the Kodaks of the world, etc. So many of them, who were the Fortune 500, and are just not there today. So, Shri, I want you to do a bit of crystal ball gazing, and maybe not crystal ball gazing because you've really done a lot of research for your book. So clearly, you understand this very well. What will be the top 3 digital technologies that you think will transform businesses and experiences in the near term?
So when we talk about the technology dimension, right, there are 3 or 4 core foundational technology pillars that are critical, right? If you recall the 10 rules in the book, I talk about replacing assumptions with data, right? Why is that important? There is so much of data that is getting generated about a company that the historical view that my systems inside the organization tell me everything is false. Because most of the data that affects the company beyond the transactions is actually resident outside of the company. It's only when you analyze what customers are talking about, what competitors are doing, what new technologies are coming up, what regulators are thinking, and be able to forecast where your industry is headed or what the opportunity is, will you be able to objectively prioritize the sequence of your transformation. So analytics is going to be number one. It's almost like driving a car without a dashboard in a snowstorm. You will never do that, right? And so the analytics are the dashboard and they are the windshield wipers. They tell you where you're headed. Number 2 is cloud, right? The amounts of data that we generate and the velocity with which we have to deliver new applications and new technologies it's at a breakneck speed. Neither of these two can be done when the fundamental infrastructure of the organization is still in the traditional format, right? The larger the company, the bigger the challenge. The faster the growth of the company, the bigger the challenge, right? And so cloud is neck to neck with business analytics as a technology paradigm. And number 3 is obviously modernizing applications. And so any and every mobile technology, web app technology, which deliver great experiences and where you can embed analytics into those applications themselves is the 3rd pillar. Now, with mobility coming in and data moving, from Reliance to you or your favorite restaurant to you, etc., data is moving outside of the firewalls of the company. It's floating around in cyberspace. That's why we hear of so many hacks. And so therefore, security becomes a very important ring fence. We're used to thinking about physical security. We have evolved from that to data center security. But to think about digital enterprise security is a very different sort of a ball game. And these 4 sort of come together to deliver the transformation to a business.
Now, if I could ask you to maybe look a little further towards the horizon, what do you think we'll be talking about in about 5 years from now? I know, currently in the technology paradigm, metaverse, for instance, is something that's very, very big now. The amalgamation of real and virtual worlds, etc. Where do you see some of these trends going, and where do you see technology 5 years from now?
Well, on a lighter note, you're asking me a question that goes against the grain of the book, which is to be data-driven, right? So I cannot graze into a crystal ball, so to speak. But still, to take a shot at it, I think in this entire digital transformation sequence, in this passage of time, we're still in the very early stage. And in the book, I talk about the first industrial revolution, right? 17th century, 18th century, and so on. The effects of that were felt outside of the British Commonwealth many, many years later, right? And so we're sort of in that phase where the plumbing of industries, the plumbing of how we govern, the plumbing of how we deliver products and services, etc., is all going through a transformation, right? The next stage of this is business transformation, right? In business transformation, what happens is that when you have digitalized your products and services, your engagement with customers from one end to the other, and your engagement with employees as well, right? Your business of today starts picking up and takes a different shape. But along the way, you start getting ideas that are completely foreign to your existing business. So in the book, I talk about how Amazon went from being a bookseller to a tech company and a retailer, right? The same thing happens to successful companies, one after the other. And so the business starts transforming. And I think in the final stage, you will see collisions between industries, right? When the value proposition of one industry entirely obsoletes the value proposition of another industry. To give you a very simple example, when the horse cart, was in prevalence, and Daimler and Benz, Carl Benz invented the first car, people would refuse to sit on it because they felt unsafe. A decade later, we came to know what happened. The entire horse cart industry, if you may, was completely wiped out. Now, if I were to continue that analogy in today, we've gone from petrol and diesel cars to hybrids to electric cars. And next is going to come flying cars, right? Which are already being approved by so many governments everywhere. Think about the consequences of that. When the flying cars becomes a commodity that is available as a GM or a Ford or a Honda or a Toyota car, and consumers are able to use it, many technologies have come together. Electric has come together. Driverless has come together because people will not be allowed to fly, right? The car and the aviation industry, automobile and aviation industry have now collided. So who will win that battle? Is it going to be Boeing or Airbus, or somebody else? Or is it going to be the car companies? And so that is sort of going to be the evolution. We will get to maybe 5 to 10 years from now, where the products and services that you use today, right, may not even exist at an industry level and then get replaced by another industry.